My hands trembled as I adjusted the tiny clasp on the silver necklace, the one my younger brother gave me during the last Christmas before he passed away. 3 years of exhaustion from overnight emergency shifts at Seattle Mercy Hospital. 3 years of scraping together every dollar to pay off school loans and the endless medical bills that should have saved him but failed. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight I was supposed to rest, to laugh, to forget the recurring nightmare that jolted me awake every few hours. Tonight was Ashley's bachelorette party, my closest friend since college, the one who had pulled me back from the emotional ledge more times than I could count. I wanted to celebrate this night with her, wanted to feel something close to being 28 again instead of feeling like an old woman who had survived a war. The streetlights cast a pale gold glow across the rain-soaked sidewalk as I stepped out of the shabby apartment building where I rented a small unit on the 3rd floor. October in Seattle was colder than I remembered. I zipped my worn faux fur coat up to my chin, the wind slipping through the sleeves, sending a shiver down my spine. The taxi was already waiting at the curb. The driver nodded without speaking, and I nodded back. On nights like this, with the rain coming down in steady sheets, there was no need for words. I leaned back against the seat, my palm still wrapped around the silver necklace, an unconscious habit whenever the old memories began to throb behind my eyes. The mix of faux leather and cheap cologne made my stomach tighten, but it was still better than being trapped in the oppressive silence of home. Ashley had texted me 3 times, reminding me not to be late. I smiled wearily. She always thought she could pull me out of my shell with glittering parties and loud music. But Ashley didn't know that I wasn't afraid of the noise. I was afraid of the silence that came after when I got home, took off my shoes, and the quiet was so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. That was what was killing me, little by little. The party was held at an upscale bar near the Western Marina, a place Ashley called where real people live, by which she meant the wealthy, the ones who always knew how to dress flawlessly, laugh just enough, and drop $10,000 in a single evening just to feel young again. I had no idea how she had befriended people like that. I only knew patience, ivy lines, and 12-hour shifts. My hair was thrown into a hurried bun, my heels were old, and the dress was borrowed from Ashley. But I came, for her, and maybe for myself. A part of me still hoped that somewhere in my life there might still be a chance to feel whole again, even if only for one night. The bar glowed with warm golden lights, soft jazz spilling from inside. I spotted Ashley's group gathered near the counter, their laughter bright and carefree, as though none of them had ever lost someone to an indifferent healthcare system. Ashley rushed toward me, her expensive perfume swirling so strongly it made me dizzy for a moment. "Rachel, you finally made it," she squealed, so happy that I couldn't bring myself to tell her how close I had been to turning back halfway. She led me to the back balcony, a private space with clear glass railings overlooking Elliott Bay. Below, dozens of yachts floated silently, glittering under the city lights. One stood out long, white, sleek, as if it belonged in a James Bond film. Ashley pointed at it, her eyes shining like a child showing off her first Christmas gift. "We're getting on that tonight," she whispered, as if sharing a forbidden secret. I looked at her and forced a smile. "You mean that one?" She nodded eagerly. "It belongs to the groom's friend. He's the quietly powerful type, but kind and very rich." I glanced at the yacht again, something strange rising inside me, a mix of curiosity and caution. When I turned back, my gaze accidentally locked onto a man standing far across the bar. He didn't smile, didn't drink, didn't do anything but stand there, hands in the pockets of his dark coat. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a sculpted face. He stood with a stillness that defied the chaotic energy of the room. While everyone else moved in a blur, he was a fixed point, an anchor of silence that commanded attention without demanding it, only for a second. But I knew instantly, with the instinct that came from years in the ER noticing subtle signs, he wasn't ordinary, and he wasn't a typical guest. Ashley kept chattering about the party, about champagne and fireworks, but I no longer heard her. Because at that moment, something inside me whispered that my life was about to change direction completely and there would be no turning back. Ashley pulled me through the crowd, leading me toward the marina, like she was taking me toward a door that might free me from the life I'd been barely holding together. The air by the docks was colder than I expected, the salty scent of the bay mixing with wine, perfume, and fading rain. Under the dock lights, the white yacht appeared like a sleeping creature, long, still, shimmering with a quiet danger. Its curves reflected the yellow glow of the lamps, bending the dreary Seattle sky, as if the boat didn't belong to this world. "What do you think?" Ashley beamed. I didn't get the chance to answer before a uniformed man stepped out from the entrance of the yacht, inviting us aboard. At the foot of the wooden stairs, I hesitated for a heartbeat, my eyes drifting once more toward the man I'd seen earlier in the bar. He now stood on the upper deck, one hand holding a glass of wine. He turned his body slightly to track my movement, perfectly steady despite the swaying deck. There was a deliberate precision in the way he faced me, a silent acknowledgement that I had walked directly into his territory. As I stepped onto the deck, my heart skipped not from wine or the overwhelming luxury, but because his eyes followed every smallest movement I made. Inside the main cabin, the soft music from the high-end speakers blended with the warm glow of the lights, creating the ambience of a luxury hotel. Caramel leather seats, a polished bar, and guests I had only ever seen in magazines. They spoke gently, laughed softly, but every gesture carried a carefully measured elegance. No one was loud, no one was overly excited. Everything felt too orchestrated, as though the entire evening had been choreographed. I drifted away from Ashley's group, stepping out onto the rear deck with a glass of white wine to let the real ocean breeze touch my skin. The bay water was still as glass, the city lights stretching across it like a blurred painting. I tilted my head toward the sky. Dark clouds were gathering in the west. Something inside me whispered again that this night would not end in laughter. The footsteps behind me were soft as the wind, yet I sensed them instantly. I turned, and for the first time, he stood before me at a distance close enough for me to see every detail of his face. A man in his mid-30s, tall, sun-tanned, with a straight nose, and a presence so commanding that the air around him felt heavier, charged with static. He wasn't dressed ostentatiously, just a black shirt and a charcoal coat, but his presence seemed to pull the space around him inward. "White wine doesn't suit cold weather," he said, his voice low, steady, with the faintest hint of a northeastern accent. I didn't know how to respond, so I lifted a shoulder in a small, awkward shrug. He glanced at my glass, then back at me. "First time on a yacht?" I nodded. "And probably the last," I replied, trying to sound playful. He lifted the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but something like acknowledgement. "Daniel," he said, extending a hand. I set my glass on the railing and took it. "Rachel." His hand was warm, firm, and held mine a moment longer than polite. For a heartbeat, the music, the waves, the distant voices, all faded under a thin, invisible veil. I didn't understand why I felt slightly afraid, yet unable to step back, and somehow, I knew that as long as I remained on this yacht, I would not be able to escape him. Daniel left not long after that, leaving me alone on the aft deck, my hand still carrying the faint warmth from his handshake, yet the air around me seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. I looked around, and the soft golden lights no longer felt warm. They blurred slightly, as if the sea mist was drawing a thin veil over everything. A breeze drifted in from the bay, not strong but sharp enough to make me wrap my arms around myself, a quiet reflex of self-protection. Inside the cabin, the music had changed, now slower, deeper, almost lullaby-like. I turned back toward the glass door and saw Ashley's group laughing, but something about their smiles felt false, as if each of them was performing a part in a play for which I had never been given the script. A couple descended the staircase on the right. The man wore a gray suit, his arm sleeved in tattoos from wrist to finger, while the woman at his side, wrapped in a black fur coat, carried eyes as cold and sharp as a blade. They didn't smile, didn't speak, simply glided past me before disappearing into a room toward the front of the deck. I tried to reassure myself that I was imagining things, that this place was far removed from the world I knew, and that the unfamiliarity was making me tense. Yet the unease in my chest kept growing, slow but certain, like something moving beneath a surface that appeared still. I went back inside, intending to find Ashley, but she was no longer with her old friends. I walked to the bar and asked a platinum-haired man who was pouring a drink. He pointed toward the staircase leading to the lower deck. She went down to look at the bedrooms. "This yacht has 6 of them, enough to host an entire honeymoon week," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. I thanked him and turned away, but the feeling of being watched returned with sharper clarity. I slowed my steps, listening, but only my own heels clicked softly across the polished wooden floor. When I looked down the hallway, I saw Daniel standing at the far end. His back rested against the railing, arms crossed, his posture rigid and unyielding, blocking the path like a sentinel. Neither of us spoke, yet in the heavy silence that settled between us, I felt something stranger than anything I had witnessed in the hospital, where I had seen life and death in their rawest forms. This was not curiosity, nor desire. It was a warning. Something was coming, and somehow I stood directly in its path. I wasn't sure whether it was Daniel's eyes or the rising sensation of being pulled into some unseen undertow that made me turn away first. I walked quickly toward the stairs, trying to slip into the crowd in the main cabin, hoping their noise and warmth would tame the chaos tightening inside me. Ashley returned just then, holding a pink cocktail, cheeks flushed with alcohol and excitement. She pulled me back toward the bar and introduced me to several new people I had never met, most of them from finance, real estate, or tech. They were well-dressed, spoke confidently, and shared one clear trait. None of them asked anything meaningful about anyone, and none truly listened. A man named Marcus, who ran a maritime logistics company in Los Angeles, began chatting with me in a proudly self-satisfied tone, but after 2 minutes, I could no longer hear his words. My thoughts kept circling back to Daniel standing at the end of the hallway, and the way his presence seemed to shape everything I had felt since stepping onto this boat. I excused myself and slipped out of the conversation, my drink still nearly full. I climbed to the yacht's upper deck, a quieter place. The air there was colder, heavier with moisture, the wind stronger but far more honest than the forced handshakes and hollow smiles below. From above, Seattle stretched beneath the murky gray sky like a sheet of fabric draped in mist. Lights from the high-rises shimmered across the dark water, scattering into strange, beautiful ribbons. I breathed deeply, trying to settle myself, but my mind continued to whirl. Something was off. I just didn't know whether it was the air, the people, or myself. Perhaps all of it. I felt each beat of my heart clearly, not because of the alcohol, but because something else was pressing in like an underwater current rushing just beneath the surface, insistent but without shape. The sound of a door opening behind me made me turn. A woman stepped out, wearing a wine-colored silk dress that clung to her frame, her blonde hair curled in soft waves, her gaze knife-sharp. She didn't look at me at first. She simply took a cigarette from her small clutch and lit it with deliberate, practiced elegance, fully aware of how much attention she commanded. I was about to turn away when she spoke, her voice light yet clear in the wind. "Your first time on Daniel's boat?" I looked back at her, surprised. "I'm just here with a friend." She nodded, as if my answer had been expected. "Everyone comes with someone on their first time." She exhaled the smoke into the wind, then looked at me again, her eyes narrowing slightly, assessing. "Be careful. Not everything that glitters is gold." She turned and walked away, her heels tapping softly until she disappeared near the elevator. I stood there, watching her fade into the dark, a nameless question echoing in my mind. I left the upper deck a few minutes later and returned to the main cabin as the sky began to change. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and swollen. The surface of the water shifted, no longer smooth but rising in uneven, restless waves. Ashley was still engaged in lively conversation near the bar, not noticing me. I glanced toward the far end of the cabin and saw Daniel standing there, silent, unmoving, like a shadow that refused to fade. He spoke to no one, yet people around him instinctively avoided the space he occupied. There was an invisible boundary around him, as if he carried his own gravity, drawing every eye while pushing everyone away. And I knew, somehow, that the night was only beginning. I stepped back onto the main deck as the sound of waves striking the hull grew louder, drowning out the music inside. None of the guests seemed to notice. They still lifted their glasses and laughed as if nothing outside existed beyond a gentle breeze. But I could see clearly that the sea had changed. The water was no longer lightly rippling. It surged in rolling swells that collided and burst into white foam. The wind whipped against my face, carrying salt and a cold that pierced straight through my coat. I pulled it tighter around myself, bracing as the yacht began to tremble with each rising wave. Above us, the sky was swallowed by thick, low clouds, so close they felt touchable. I turned toward the cabin and saw a few guests reacting at last. A man near the window pulled out his phone, only to find no signal, confusion flickering across his face. A woman wobbled as the yacht tilted slightly, clutching her dress for balance. The storm was no longer a warning. It was coming, truly coming, and faster than anyone could prepare for. Ashley appeared beside me, gripping my arm with both hands. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her face pale. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the dark water. "Should we go below?" I asked. But before either of us could move, the yacht lurched harder, nearly throwing several people off balance. A glass slipped from a woman's hand and shattered across the floor, the sharp, brittle sound slicing through the trance that had held everyone. Screams began to rise as lights flickered, the sound system cutting in and out. A uniformed crew member rushed by, speaking urgently into a radio. I looked around for Daniel but couldn't find him. My heartbeat quickened, partly out of fear, partly out of the sense that he was somewhere very close. I nudged Ashley behind me, telling her to hold onto the railing, then moved quickly toward the forward deck. I wasn't sure why I was doing it, whether it was instinct or something deeper inside urging me to find Daniel in the middle of all this chaos. The wind howled in violent, tearing gusts as the rain poured down with a force that felt almost vengeful. The first drops were heavy as stones, striking my face with a sharp sting. I raised a hand to shield my eyes, forcing myself forward across the slick deck. Voices shouted, objects clattered and broke, waves crashed relentlessly against the hull. I saw a door on the left blown wide open, the lights inside flickering, and a shadow darted out too quickly for me to recognize. The yacht lurched hard to the left, sending me stumbling, my foot catching on a metal bar fixed to the floor. In that fraction of a second, I lost my balance and pitched toward the railing. My hand caught the edge, but it was wet and slippery, and my body slid forward. Everything happened in a handful of seconds, too fast for anyone to react. I saw the dark, gaping water open beneath me, an expanse of cold and terrifying nothingness. The wind's roar was suddenly strangled, and then I fell. The seawater was a blade of cold. It crushed around me, tightening around my chest, pulling me down as if a pair of unseen hands were dragging me under. I thrashed, my head striking something hard, my throat burning as the salt water surged in. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heartbeat and a deep, muffled roar, like being trapped inside a giant seashell. A flash of lightning split the sky above, illuminating the surface for a heartbeat, and in that brief burst of light, I saw a dark silhouette dive. In, from above, broad shoulders, decisive movement, then everything went black. As my body drifted through the freezing water, suspended somewhere between life and death, only one thing remained clear in my fading consciousness. Those eyes. The eyes that had followed me all evening, as if they had known something was coming, and now they were pulling me back. My body sank rapidly in the icy darkness, my coat growing heavier as it dragged me down further, every sense blurring as the black water swallowed me. I tried to open my eyes, but the salt burned them until they felt raw, the faint shapes around me dissolving into a smear of shadow. My arms flailed out of instinct, but my legs felt numb, my lungs screamed for air, my throat clamped tight as if held by an invisible fist. In my mind, I heard Ashley scream, the faces at the party, then all of it slipping away like scattered fragments. I no longer knew which way was up or down. There was only a single, undeniable sensation. I was being pulled away from the world, second by second. And then, in the chaos, I felt a powerful force yank my body backward. An arm wrapped firmly around my chest, cold but unyielding, followed by a swift, strong upward surge, cutting through the suffocating weight of the water that tried to keep me. I forced my eyes open again, and this time, through the blurred darkness, I saw a familiar face. Daniel. He said nothing, and he didn't need to. His whole body tensed, his grip tight around me as his legs kicked through the water in hard, steady strokes. I heard the surface rupture above us as we broke through, the world splitting open with the sound of shattering waves. Air rushed into my lungs like a violent stab of life, painful and burning. I coughed uncontrollably, my vision swimming, my hands clutching at his shoulders without thinking. The rain still lashed down, the wind screamed, and the yacht loomed far behind us like a pale phantom flickering between foam and lightning. Daniel shouted something, his voice drowned by the storm, but I felt the vibration of it through his chest. He pulled me closer, one hand keeping my head above the surface, the other fighting to keep us afloat amid the growing, furious waves. For a fleeting moment, I felt his breath near my ear, warm against the freezing night. "I'm not letting you die," he said, the words slicing through the chaos like a cold, sharp blade. "You're not leaving me." It wasn't a command, nor a plea. It was a truth, a vow spoken by a man I didn't understand but instinctively believed in that singular, terrifying moment. We drifted toward a small lifeboat knocked loose from the main yacht. Daniel turned, pushing me toward it first. I grabbed onto the edge with shaking hands, hauling myself up with the last scraps of strength I had. He climbed in after me, soaked, bruised, every breath harsh and ragged. Daniel sat beside me, his hand still gripping my shoulder. I turned to him, my body trembling, from the cold. He reached out, gripping my shoulder firmly, his hand radiating a heat fiercer than the storm itself, an undeniable presence. I was alive, because of him, and I knew, deep down, that the moment he dove into the water after me had been a point of no return not just for me, for him as well. I awoke to dim light and the faint smell of antiseptic, my body aching as if it had been crushed beneath a truck. Every muscle, every joint, protested my very existence. It took several seconds for me to register the room around me, a small space with low ceilings, concrete walls, dim yellow light coating everything in a muted, shadowy haze. I lay on a narrow bed, wrapped in thin blankets, my clothes dry but my skin still faintly damp. My heart began to race as memories crashed over me like waves. The storm, the shouts, the cold water clawing at my lungs, and then his hands. I sat up too quickly, a dizzy spell hitting me so hard I had to brace myself against the mattress. The door creaked open, footsteps approached, and then he appeared. Daniel. He stood there, a towel in one hand and a glass of water in the other. The impeccably tailored coat was gone, replaced by a rumpled shirt and the palpable weight of exhaustion. He didn't look at me immediately, yet something in his demeanor had changed. Fatigue, tension, the look of someone who had not taken his eyes off me since pulling me from the water. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and steady. I stared at him, unable to answer. The questions in my mind crashed and tangled so violently that I couldn't form a single sentence. Daniel set the glass on a small wooden table beside the bed. "You passed out after we got onto the lifeboat. We brought you to a safe house nearby, in the southern port area of Seattle." I glanced around, realizing this wasn't a hospital, no machines, no nurses, only a bare, functional room, and that alone made my pulse spike with warning. "Why am I not in a hospital?" I asked, my voice rough. Daniel sat on the chair across from me, his fingers interlaced. "Because if we took you to a hospital, other people would know you survived, and I'm not sure that would be safe for you." His words thickened the air instantly. I frowned. "What do you mean? Who wants me dead?" Daniel watched me for a long moment, unblinking. "I don't know yet, but the incident on the yacht wasn't just weather." I gripped the edge of the blanket, my breath tightening. "So someone wanted me gone?" He nodded once. "And if I hadn't been there, you would likely be at the bottom of the bay right now." I pushed myself to my feet, stumbling a little, unable to look away from him. "I don't understand. I'm just a nurse. I don't have enemies. I don't know anything about those people. I don't even know who you are. Why me?" My voice rose, trembling with fear and anger. Daniel didn't stand, but his voice dropped, controlled and certain. "Because you weren't just some stranger who wandered into the wrong party. You're the only person who saw something no one was supposed to see. And you're alive, which makes you a problem." I stepped back, my spine pressing against the wall. Every part of me was screaming to leave this place, to escape. Yet something in the way Daniel spoke held my eyes exactly where he wanted them. He wasn't lying, he wasn't softening the truth, and he wasn't hiding the danger. "So, I'm being kept here?" I asked, my voice brittle. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You're being protected." I let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Protected?" "By locking me in a room with no windows, no phone, nothing I can use to contact anyone." Daniel stood, walked toward the door, then turned back to me. "If I wanted you gone, I wouldn't have jumped into the water in the middle of a storm to save you. I'm trying to keep you alive. And if you're wise, you'll start believing that." He opened the door, pausing for a single breath before stepping out. "Get some rest. We'll talk when you're sober enough to hear things that are far worse." And then he was gone. The door closed behind him, and I stood there alone, surrounded by unanswered questions and a heartbeat pounding loud enough to drown out every thought except one. There was no returning to the life I had before, and the only person who could guide me down whatever path lay ahead was the man I feared most in this room. I couldn't sleep after Daniel left. My mind felt submerged in a dense tide of fear, doubt, and questions without edges or endings. Everything had happened too fast, too strangely. A party, a storm, a fall. A man I barely knew risking his life to pull me from the freezing water. And now I was here, held in a place called safe, but with nothing that resembled freedom. I paced the narrow room, my footsteps soft like whispers. No windows, no phone, no clock. Time felt swallowed whole. I started wondering whether I was spiraling, whether this was nothing more than the aftershock of nearly drowning. And then Daniel returned. He knocked twice before entering, carrying a thin laptop and a thick folder. His face still wore tension, but the icy edge had dulled. He placed everything on the table and motioned for me to sit. "I think it's time you knew a few things," he said as he opened the laptop. A soft blue glow lit his face as a grainy surveillance clip flickered onto the screen. It showed the yacht's deck close to midnight. The dark made details hazy, but there was clearly a figure shadowing me from the moment I stepped onto the rear deck. He moved silently, blending into the storm and the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment. I narrowed my eyes, my heartbeat thudding as the footage paused on the instant the yacht lurched violently. The figure didn't stumble like the others. Instead, he lunged forward, his hands shoving me hard against the railing just as the wave hit. It happened in a split second, disguised by the chaos of the storm. Daniel zoomed in. The resolution was poor, but the figure wasn't dressed like any crew member. No uniform. Movements too sharp, too practiced. I turned to him, my blood running cold. He pushed me? It wasn't just the storm? Daniel nodded slowly, his expression grim. "It wasn't an accident, Rachel. It was an execution attempt made to look like one." I stepped back, a cold shiver racing down my spine. "Why? I don't know any of them." "I was just there with Ashley." Daniel opened the folder, flipped through a few pages, then slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of me standing with Ashley in the bar before the party, taken from afar, clearly not by a friend out for fun. "You were being watched before you even boarded the yacht. They mistook you for one of my people." I frowned. "Which group?" Daniel paused, and his voice dropped lower. "A hidden faction involved in a laundering network on the East Coast. I used to have business with them. 3 months ago, I cut ties and handed internal evidence to a neutral organization. They've been trying to send me messages ever since. But this time, they mistook you for someone I embedded in Ashley's circle." I tried to piece it all together. "Then, what did you mean when you said I was the only one who saw what no one was supposed to see?" Daniel turned the screen toward me again, this time showing another angle of the rear deck. There I was, walking toward the railing just before the fall, and not far behind me was a man in a baseball cap, holding up his phone, secretly recording. Daniel spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "You walked into the middle of an exchange between two people who should never be filmed, and they believe you have the evidence." I shuddered not from cold, but from a deeper fear than anything I had ever known. I was just a nurse. I never intended to step into their world. I knew nothing about money, power, or underground networks, but now I was the only witness. I looked at Daniel, and for the first time I saw not coldness in his eyes, but tension that bordered on pain. "Why did you save me? Why not let me go, if I'm nothing but collateral damage?" He was silent for a long moment before answering slowly. "Because if I let you die, I become part of the way they do things. And I can't live one more day if that happens." His words stunned me. In that moment, amid the flood of uncertainty, I knew only one thing. Daniel was telling the truth. And that truth made everything more terrifying. Because now I understood that I wasn't just pulled into a war that wasn't mine. I had become the reason a man who lived in shadows was forced to choose a different side. I sat alone beside the one small window in the apartment, my eyes tracing the slow trail of raindrops sliding down the glass, my heart heavy as stone. The room was so quiet I could hear the tick of the wall clock, each second slicing deeper into my scattered thoughts. Everything felt unreal, far beyond the comprehension of someone who lived among patients, prescriptions, and night shifts. Less than 2 days ago, I was an ordinary nurse, exhausted from work and carrying wounds that still hadn't healed. Now I was an unwilling witness in a world I had never believed existed outside old black-and-white films. I didn't know what frightened me more, the truth I had learned, or the man who pulled me from the water, the man whose eyes always seemed to want to keep me close while hiding a part of himself I could never reach. Daniel left me alone after our conversation. He didn't lock the door, didn't threaten me, didn't try to comfort me. He left me with pieces I couldn't put together, as if he knew there were no words that could mend the quiet collapse happening inside me. I didn't know how much to believe. Not because he lacked credibility, but because he had too much of it. Every piece fit too perfectly, and that was what terrified me. I wasn't someone naturally suspicious, but when your life is ripped out of your hands in an instant, trust becomes a luxury. I clenched my hands, my nails digging into my palms. Why me? Just because I stood in the wrong place, looked in the wrong direction, at the wrong moment? Or because I let myself get pulled into a life that wasn't mine simply because of a single look? I didn't want to think that. But I couldn't deny that from the first moment on the yacht, I'd known Daniel wasn't like anyone I had ever met. He wasn't only the person who saved me. He was the only one who truly saw me, saw through me in a sea of artificial smiles and empty laughter. I stood and walked around the apartment, each wall silent as though listening to my unspoken thoughts. This place was designed so no one could find it, but to me, it felt like a more sophisticated cage. I wasn't being held captive, but I couldn't leave. Not because Daniel stopped me, but because I no longer knew where to go. I couldn't return to the hospital. I couldn't call Ashley. I couldn't slip back into my old life as if none of this had happened. I had seen something I wasn't meant to see, and now I was no longer the person I had been. I sat back on the edge of the bed, my fingers finding the silver necklace my brother once gave me, the last thread tying me to the world I used to know. Tears fell, not loud or desperate, just quiet drops landing in my hands. I wasn't crying out of fear, but because, for the first time in my life, I didn't know who I was, where I belonged, or what waited ahead. And beneath all those broken pieces was the one question that refused to release me. Was Daniel truly on my side? Or was I just another part of the game he was trying to control? I had barely wiped the last warm tear from my cheek when the phone began to ring, the unlisted one Daniel kept in the small drawer, beside the bed. My heart jolted forward as if I had been ripped from a nightmare of shadows. Daniel had told me only 2 people knew this number, and that I was forbidden from calling anyone. But no one said I couldn't answer when it rang. I picked it up, hesitating for a single breath before pressing the button. Instead of silence or Daniel's voice, a stranger's crisp, professional tone spoke first. "Miss Rachel, this is Jonas, security detail. We've intercepted a distressed attempt to locate you coming from an unsecured line. The source is verified as friendly but compromised. I am patching it through securely now. Do not hang up." Before I could process his words, the line clicked, and then came the sound of frantic breathing, followed by a voice so familiar it froze my spine. "Ashley." "Rachel, is that you? Oh my God, it's really you?" Her voice trembled, thick with panic and so unsteady I couldn't even respond before she pushed on, each word forced out as if she were running out of air. "I thought you were dead. They said you fell into the water. No one could find you. I don't know what's happening anymore." I tightened my grip on the phone and shot to my feet. "Ashley, where are you? Are you safe?" There was a pause, then a shaky breath, as if she were hiding somewhere no one should know about. "I'm not sure. Someone's been following me. Ever since that night. They don't talk. They just show up everywhere. A man, tall, wearing glasses, staring at me like I'm a threat. Rachel, that wasn't just an accident, was it?" I stared at the wall in front of me, Daniel's warning echoing again and again in my head. No one except me was supposed to see what happened, but Ashley had been there. She hadn't fallen. She was still out in the open while I was locked away in another world. "Ashley, listen to me," I said quickly, lowering my voice. "You have to leave Seattle, right now. Find somewhere safe, and don't contact anyone. No one." But she cut me off, her voice cracking. "Rachel, they know about you. Someone asked me about you, a man with salt and pepper hair. He knew your hospital. He knew your shifts. He asked if you were still alive. I didn't know what to say. Rachel, I'm terrified. A cold feeling crept up my spine, hollowing me out from the inside. Everything she said sliced through the thin, protective shell Daniel had built around me. If they had already reached Ashley, it was only a matter of time before they discovered that I was alive. I was dragging my friend into danger I had no way of shielding her from. Ashley, please, disappear for a few days. Don't go home. Don't go to work. I'll contact you when I can. But hang up now. She hesitated, then whispered through a tight throat. Are you okay? I swallowed hard, my voice shrinking. I don't know, but I'm alive. The call ended in silence. I stood frozen as the phone slipped from my everday, fingers onto the mattress, and for the first time since everything began, something more terrifying than confusion settled over me. The unmistakable sense of being hunted. And I wasn't the only one. Night settled faster than I expected. After the call with Ashley, time no longer followed any familiar rhythm. It warped and twisted inside the quiet of the cold room, stretching and contracting until the hours lost their shape. I couldn't sleep or read, my mind spinning with fractured images. The black water, Daniel's hands gripping me, the face of the salt and pepper-haired man Ashley described, and the constant sensation of being watched even though I was no longer out in the open. When Daniel stepped into the room, the hallway light behind him cast his shadow long across the wooden floor. But this time, I didn't flinch or step back. I looked straight at him, my questions unspoken but undeniable. He knew I had answered the phone. And now I needed the truth, not from a video or a sealed document, but from the real man standing in front of me. Daniel didn't seem surprised. He didn't ask what happened. He simply walked to the chair across from me and sat down as if he had been waiting for this moment. Silence settled between us, heavy but not suffocating, like two strangers sitting together in a train station at midnight, unsure which train would arrive first, but knowing there was no going back. I used to believe I could control everything, he began, his voice rough and low, like aged whiskey. Every deal, every person, every risk. I thought with enough logic and money, I could avoid loss. I didn't interrupt. I just watched him, seeing for the first time a layer beneath his cold exterior, exhaustion and pain. But then I realized there are things you can't buy back, things you can't rearrange, like my younger brother's death. I leaned forward slightly. Daniel held my gaze without blinking. He died in an accident I could have prevented, but I was in the middle of a deal, a 6-hour meeting, and I didn't pick up my phone. My chest tightened, not because of the facts he shared, but because I knew that flavor of regret. I knew how it lived under the skin, how it seeped into sleep, into every glance in the mirror. I spoke softly. My younger brother died too. Not an accident, but a heart condition. I worked as a nurse for 3 years to pay for his medication, but by the time I finally had enough for the surgery, it was already too late. Daniel didn't reply. We just sat there, two people who once believed they had done everything they could, only to discover that life never rewards effort on time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. Inside was an old folding knife, its blade scratched, the wooden handle worn down. It was his. I keep it to remind myself there are things I'll never fix. I nodded and touched the pendant around my neck, the small piece of silver engraved with my brother's name. Me too. Our eyes met again, this time without the need for explanation. Between us, there was a fracture raw, human, and aching, and somehow we needed each other not to fill it, but simply to remain, not with promises or safety, but with the quiet presence of someone who understood that pain doesn't erase people, it makes them more real. And in that still, fragile night, I began to understand why Daniel had saved me. And I also began to realize I was no longer certain my heart could stay untouched with him sitting this close. After a silence that felt as though it might never end, Daniel poured a drink for each of us from the old bottle of whiskey on the shelf, his movements slow and deliberate, as if every gesture carried its own private weight. We sat together in the small living room, the dim yellow light casting a soft glow over the amber in our glasses, and though the space between us felt less tense, it had thickened into something like an unspoken understanding. I rotated the glass lightly in my hand, my eyes fixed on the scratches etched into the wooden table, the echo of the night before still lingering inside me. Daniel didn't speak for a long while. He simply stared into the empty space ahead of him, and then, as if something inside him had finally unlocked, he began to talk, his voice low and steady, without expression yet carrying the quiet ache of a melody without notes. My father was a man obsessed with control, a man who breathed rules he created and expected everyone around him to obey. He never hit me or my brother, never yelled at my mother, but he killed everything with coldness, with a gaze sharp enough to make you feel small for breathing the wrong way. I grew up not knowing what he liked, what he feared, or what he ever loved. The only thing I knew was that he despised weakness, he despised failure, and I was the greatest disappointment he ever had. I didn't attend the school he wanted, didn't follow the career he chose, and I abandoned the name he forced the entire family to carry as some symbol of power. When I was 19, I left home, taking my 8-year-old brother with me, the last possession my father considered his. We lived together, we grew up together, two people running from the ghost of a man who never laid a hand on anyone but left wounds that never healed. I did everything I could to keep that kid from becoming another version of him. And I almost succeeded, until the accident. I missed his last call because I was in the middle of a negotiation I thought would change our lives. I chose money, and I lost him. Daniel paused, taking a long swallow of whiskey, his fingers tightening around the glass until his knuckles blanched. I said nothing. I simply reached out and laid my hand over his, offering a wordless compassion that felt almost like a shared language. And then I began to speak, my voice so soft it hardly felt like it came from my own throat. My brother's Olod. Name was Evan. He was 7 years younger than me, smart, funny, always smiling, the kind of smile that made the whole day feel possible. After our mother died of cancer and our father left, it was just the two of us. I did everything, waiting tables, working overnight shifts at the clinic to pay for his school, his medicine. Evan had a congenital heart condition, but at first the doctors said it was mild, that he only needed monitoring. We believed them. We believed that if I worked hard enough, long enough, everything would be fine. But when he turned 15, things got worse. I took extra shifts, gave up sleep, saved every cent for the surgery. And then one day, after a 12-hour shift, I got a message from him saying his chest hurt. By the time I got there, it was too late. I can still feel the way I ran through that hospital, still wearing my lab coat, only to find an empty bed cold and silent. There was no one left, nothing left. Daniel didn't speak. He only squeezed my hand, and we sat there like two people no longer facing their past but slowly loosening the knots that had strangled their hearts for years. On nights that stretched endlessly, pain was often the most honest thing we had, and somewhere in that silence between us, something began to resemble trust. Not because his past made me trust him, but because I saw in him a wound like my own, different in the details, identical in the shape of loss. Perhaps only people who have lost that deeply can truly understand the value of someone who stays beside them in a wordless night, offering nothing but presence and not walking away. The rain kept falling quietly outside, each drop tapping against the glass like an uneven heartbeat inside my chest. We hadn't moved from our seats since our stories ended. There were no condolences, no empty reassurances, just the quiet presence of two people far too used to hiding their tears in long, heavy silences. Daniel's hand remained over mine, warm and steady, neither holding tightly nor letting go. I couldn't tell if it was the whiskey, the enclosed space, or simply the way the emptiness between us had slowly filled with understanding. But suddenly the distance separating us felt fragile, almost breakable. Daniel turned to me, and his eyes were no longer guarded, no longer cold. They were bare in a way that made me look away just to keep my breathing steady, but I didn't pull my hand back. And when he gently reached up to brush a rain-damp strand of hair from my cheek, I didn't stop him. His fingertips moved slowly across my skin, as if he were touching an old memory he feared might shatter. My heartbeat stuttered, my mouth went dry, and the space between us held longer than a single breath. I saw his lips part, as if he were about to speak, but instead of words, he leaned toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. In that suspended instant, the room felt completely still. I didn't move away. I didn't move closer. I stayed exactly where I was, not because I was swept up in the moment, but because I wasn't sure whether I was ready for what might come after. The distance between us closed to only a few inches, his breath brushing my cheek, warm and carrying the faint scent of charred wood and whiskey. But then, in a heartbeat, I saw something shift in his eyes. He stopped, not pulling back, but not moving forward either. His hand remained on my cheek, gentle yet paused, and I knew he was waiting for me to decide. I lowered my gaze and said nothing. What I felt wasn't simple longing, it was fear. Not fear of him, but fear of myself, of losing the line between gratitude and something deeper, something more dangerous. Daniel withdrew his hand, slowly and with respect, as though he understood everything I couldn't say aloud. He leaned back slightly, his expression softening, not disappointed, not accusing. "I'm sorry," he murmured, almost too quietly to hear. I shook my head. "No, you don't have to apologize." I stood and walked toward the window, watching the rain fall in steady lines. My heart was far from calm, battling emotions too new and too perilous. I didn't know what had stopped us in that moment, logic or our ghosts. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Something unnamed had formed between us, and even though it hadn't crossed into love, it was no longer the distance between strangers. And that was the part that frightened me most. I couldn't sleep after that night, not because of the lingering rain or the soft sound of Daniel's footsteps in the hallway, but because of a single question that beat steadily in my mind like a muted drum. Was I beginning to fall in love with a dangerous man? I kept thinking about the way he looked at me when he touched me, not rushed, not possessive, but with a gentleness so unexpected it made me forget everything I thought I knew about him. And it was that gentleness that frightened me most. How could someone like Daniel, with a past stitched together from blurred, shadowy fragments, with connections tied to men who could kill without hesitation, have eyes so sorrowful when he talked about his brother? How could he sit up with me through the night, saying nothing, simply listening as I spoke about Evan, about the years I spent tearing my palms open out of helplessness? I couldn't reconcile those pieces. Daniel was two men in one body. One was a ghost born in the underworld, and the other was a man who would stop the second I seemed unsure of wanting him to take another step. Could it be that both versions of him were real? I watched the scars on his hands as he washed the dishes the next morning. I didn't ask. I simply remembered. I heard the way he answered the phone, his voice deep, clipped, edged with authority and warning. I saw him leave before sunrise, returning with mud on his shoes and no explanation. He never lied, but he never told the whole truth either. And I couldn't stop wondering, if Daniel had killed someone, would I believe he had a reason? If he did something bad for the sake of something good, could I live with that? I had never asked those questions about anyone before, and strangely, the only person who made me ask them was the one who had saved my life. I remembered the moment he pulled me from the water, the way his arms locked around me, giving me a sense of safety, even though I knew he himself could be as dangerous as the storm that swallowed me. But I also remembered his voice when he spoke of his father, of his past, and of how he refused to become the man he was raised by. And if he was trying to walk out of the darkness, then what exactly was I in that journey? A question mark, or a chance at redemption? I looked at myself in the mirror and met my own lost gaze staring back. I didn't know if I was drawn to who he truly was, or to the idea of a man who could save me both physically and emotionally. But I knew one thing. Whatever I was feeling no longer belonged to the safe parts of myself. And once the heart begins to waver, reason is no longer strong enough to keep a person still. I began to doubt not only him, but myself. That morning, I woke in a haze between sleep and waking, my throat dry, and my eyes heavy from a night spent staring at the ceiling. I dragged myself out of the room, expecting nothing but a cold kitchen and familiar silence. But the first thing I saw was a small porcelain cup placed neatly on the table, steam curling softly upward, beside a piece of toast cut into 3 equal parts. No note, no instructions, only the faint scent of chamomile tea, the same tea I had mentioned once, just once, on the rainy night when both of us believed we had no one left who cared about small things. I stood frozen for a long moment before sitting down, my fingers brushing the warm rim of the cup. Daniel wasn't there, but somehow his presence felt more solid than ever. Not through promises, not through half-hearted embraces, but through a gesture so small most people would overlook it unless they cared. I remembered telling him sleepily that when I was exhausted, a sip of chamomile tea was enough to soften the sharp edges inside me, and he remembered. In a world built on coldness and survival, Daniel had chosen to listen to something that meant nothing to anyone but me. That single moment made the fog of doubt inside me lift just enough, not because I was convinced he was good, but because I could see he was trying not to be consumed by the darkness that had shaped him, trying to protect me with whatever he could control, and most importantly, trying to show me he wasn't only what others believed him to be. I sat there, took a sip of the tea, and for the first time since meeting Daniel, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not because I had found answers, but because I sensed I was no longer afraid of the question. Only one day after the quiet morning of chamomile tea and silent toast, Daniel woke me just before dawn. His voice was low, brief, not exactly tense but stripped of the softness he occasionally allowed himself. I understood immediately what it meant. Something had shifted. The darkness he'd kept at the door had begun to close in. We left the apartment through the back, the black car already waiting with its engine running. The driver, a man I had never seen before. Daniel didn't introduce him. He simply motioned for me to get in, then sat beside me, his expression calm but edged with the kind of stillness that hides storms. The drive took nearly 2 hours, weaving through fog-drenched suburbs before climbing into harsher terrain surrounded by dense forest. When the car stopped, a small wooden cabin appeared before us, tucked beneath towering pines, blanketed with moss and patches of old snow. No fence, no cameras, no sign of human life, except for a small antenna rising from the roof. Daniel led me inside, each step purposeful, as if he knew every creaking board and nail by memory. The cabin had only 2 rooms, a bedroom and a living space connected to the kitchen, but everything was arranged with precision. Medical kits neatly stacked, a pair of handguns hidden in drawers, even an emergency escape hatch concealed beneath the rug. I stood in the modest kitchen gripping the strap of my backpack, not from fear, but because, for the first time, I understood what it meant to prepare for battle. Not in movies, not on paper, but in reality. Daniel didn't say much. He handed me thick wool clothing, a wind-resistant coat, and specialized boots. When I finished changing, I found him checking communication equipment, his eyes taut like drawn wire, though his expression remained steady. Every movement was practiced, calculated, familiar, as if he had spent his entire life making choices between life and death. Only when he looked up and met my gaze did he stop, walk toward me, and speak in the lowest voice I had ever heard from him. "They're getting closer. Not just to you, but to me. Every trace is gone, but I don't know how long this place will stay hidden." I nodded, not asking why he brought me here, because I understood. To him, this was the last checkpoint, the place where there was no one left to rely on except each other. He wasn't just trying to protect me. He was showing me the truth of a man who had lived in danger all his life, yet still found a way to arrange the world in whatever order he could control. We spent the entire afternoon preparing. I learned how to use the radio, how to open the emergency safe, how to read the escape map through the woods in case we were attacked. No one spoke about tomorrow or the days ahead. Every question was swallowed back, as if giving fear a name would make it real. Night fell quickly, and the wind hissed through the old trees, making the cabin grow colder by the minute. When I lit the small candle on the table, Daniel's shadow stretched tall against the wall, still and carved, like a mark left by something ancient. I looked at him, and for the first time, I no longer saw him as a dangerous man. I saw someone who had long grown accustomed to having no one at his side, yet still chose to create a safe space for someone else if they needed it. And this time, that someone was me. The first sound came from the window, a soft brush, like a breath of wind sliding across the glass, but Daniel shot to his feet instantly, without an ounce of hesitation. I had been curled beneath a thin blanket on the couch when I felt the air shift in an instant, as though the cabin itself had been pulled taut by an invisible hand. Daniel signaled for me to stay silent, and the look in his eyes was no longer the man who made chamomile tea in the morning, but a warrior, his body strung tight with instinct. I didn't ask anything. I simply nodded and followed as he guided me behind the wooden partition, which concealed a narrow stairway leading to a basement I had once assumed was just storage. He pushed the hatch open and urged me down first, then crouched to hand me a small flashlight. "Do not come up unless I call for you," he whispered softly enough not to disturb the air around us. I wanted to ask what was happening, but he had already closed the hatch, leaving me alone in a space thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. I folded myself into the corner, my heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might break through my ribs. The air pressed around me, dense as a shapeless threat. Then the gunshots came. Not one, two, three, followed by the shatter of glass, the thud of footsteps on the wooden floor above me, and the violent crash of bodies hitting furniture. I clamped my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Every instinct I had told me to hide, to stay silent, but another part of me screamed just as loudly. What if Daniel was hurt? What if he couldn't handle it alone? My hands trembled as I opened the small bag Daniel had given me earlier, pulling out the pistol I had learned to assemble only 2 days ago. I shook so hard I nearly dropped it, but I forced my breath steady. I was no longer the nurse who only saved lives in the safety of a hospital. I was someone being hunted, and the only person who had ever saved me was upstairs facing it alone. I lifted the hatch when the shots stopped, my heart turning weightless with terror. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the flashlight Daniel had left on the table. A stranger lay motionless near the fireplace, blood blooming across his shirt. Daniel was nowhere in sight. From the back room, I heard the sound of a struggle, the thud of bodies, the snap of wood, something heavy falling. I moved quickly but carefully, the gun tight in my hands, each step carrying me closer to the noise. When I reached the doorway, the scene froze in front of me. Daniel was pinned sideways against the table, held down by a huge man, his arm braced in resistance but clearly weakening. His eyes lifted to mine, not panicked but flashing with a warning like fire cutting through darkness. I didn't think. I didn't count. I raised the gun, gripped it with both hands, and pulled the trigger. The explosion cracked through the small room. Then silence fell like a curtain. The man staggered, released Daniel, and collapsed onto the floor. Daniel looked at me, breath ragged, blood trailing down one arm. I rushed to him, gun still in hand, dropping to my knees. "You're hurt," I said, my voice unsteady. "Let me see." He nodded, a faint smile appearing tilted, exhausted. "You fired," he rasped. I thought I wouldn't make it in time. I bit down hard on my lip, pulling bandages from my pocket, trying to stop the bleeding while my hands still trembled. Not from fear anymore, but from adrenaline that hadn't yet burned out. I had shot a man. I had stepped out of the fragile shell of the nurse I once was, and into a world where compassion had no place, only survival. A sharp alarm suddenly blared from the device near the kitchen, signaling more people approaching. Daniel looked at me, and this time nothing in his eyes was hidden. "We have to go. Now." I nodded without a single question. There was no room left for panic or regret. We weren't the people we had been before, and I understood then this night was only the beginning. We had barely stepped out of the gunpowder-scented room when the door near the kitchen burst open, and a tall, bearded man, holding a gun, rushed in. Daniel lifted a hand, signaling safety before I could react. The man was Jonas, one of Daniel's former security men, someone who had vanished from the radar weeks earlier, but he wasn't alone. Behind him was a young woman, heavily pregnant, pale and trembling as she clung to Jonas like she might collapse at any moment. The moment she saw us, she let out a cry, both hands wrapping around her belly as she sank to the floor. I ran to her in pure instinct. Her hands were ice cold, sweat pouring across her forehead. Her water had broken. I looked up at Jonas. His eyes were wide with panic, torn between holding his gun and catching his wife before she fell. I inhaled deeply, pushing away images of blood and chaos, and said every word clearly. "She has to deliver. Now. There's no time to go anywhere." Daniel immediately cleared a space near the fireplace, moving furniture aside in swift, controlled motions. I grabbed the medical kit, tore open gloves and masks, and felt an old version of myself rise, the one who knew what to do in the night shifts at Seattle Mercy. The first scream made my entire body tense, but I forced myself to focus on each step. She was so young, barely in her mid-20s, fragile and exhausted from running. I spoke to her softly, guiding her through every breath, keeping her eyes on mine. Daniel stood behind me, silent but steady, his presence like a wall holding the chaos back. Jonas knelt beside his wife, his hands shaking as he held hers, his eyes red, whether from fear or gratitude. I couldn't tell when I said everything was progressing normally. Each time her scream tore through the room, I felt my heart thump with it. And then, after minutes that felt like an entire lifetime, the baby cried for the first time. a thin, piercing sound that sliced through the thick night surrounding us. I wrapped the infant, checked the breathing and heartbeat, then placed the child in the mother's arms. She burst into tears, and Jonas did too, the two of them holding each other as if nothing else in the world mattered but this fragile miracle. I stepped back, my hands still trembling but my heart strangely light. Daniel handed me a towel, and his eyes held no suspicion, no distance, only recognition. No one said a word for the next 10 minutes. The small cabin sank into the steady breathing of a newborn child, the soft drizzle tapping against the wooden roof, and the frantic rhythm still pounding inside my chest. In a world where death lurked outside every door, life had somehow found its way in. And I, Rachel, the woman who once believed she had nothing left to trust, had just brought a tiny soul into this world. There were no surgical lights, no monitors, only faith and the trembling hands of someone who once wanted to give up everything. Yet in that moment, I understood why I was still here. Because there was still something worth protecting. As the baby's cries slowly faded, I turned and saw Daniel leaning forward, his hand gripping his shoulder, his face tightening with pain. A splinter of wood from the earlier fight had cut across his shoulder, and blood soaked through the white shirt. My heart clenched, beating with renewed urgency as I stepped toward him, pushing aside exhaustion and fear until only pure focus remained. I slipped off my coat, cleaned the blood, and disinfected the wound with trembling but steady hands. His muscles tensed beneath my touch, but he didn't make a sound, only furrowed his brow, his gaze still sharp with determination. I guided him to sit near the makeshift fireplace, tending to him. His muscles were coiled tight beneath my hands, but as he exhaled, I sensed exhaustion, fear, and a raw vulnerability that he never allowed the world to see. Daniel took my hand, his fingers warm and heavy, and for the first time since we met, his voice shook as he whispered, "Thank you for staying, for not leaving me." I looked at him and saw not the dangerous, powerful, stone-cold man the world believed he was, but a man carrying unbearable weight, walking alone through darkness to protect the few he still loved. I touched his face gently, my hand lingering against the hard line of his cheek, and felt my heart tremble with a softness I hadn't felt in years. We sat beside each other in the dim cabin, speaking no words, letting presence alone ease the chaos that had nearly swallowed us whole. He looked at me, and in his eyes was something I had never seen before. Not dominance, not control, but trust and an aching vulnerability, as if he were telling me he needed protection too. I rested my hand over his chest, feeling the heartbeat still steady but weaker than usual, my worry mixing with a warmth that unfurled inside me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. The quiet was gentle, wrapped in the sound of rain and the glow of the fire. And Daniel leaned toward me, letting his head rest lightly on my shoulder, releasing the exhaustion he had carried for so long. The moment needed no words, only the truth of two people who had just survived a storm, saved a life, and discovered that even in the midst of shadows and death, there were fragile sparks of trust and real emotion. I whispered softly, a faint smile touching my lips. "You need rest. I'm here." Daniel's grip on my hand tightened, his gaze brushing mine with a silent admission that he didn't always have to be strong, that even the strongest men sometimes needed someone to lean on. We sat still, close enough to feel each other's warmth, and everything outside, danger, conflict, threats, drifted back into the distance, leaving only honesty and connection, something I never believed could exist between us. In that moment, in the messy cabin filled with the smell of gunpowder and the damp breath of the forest rain, I realized a simple but profound truth. Amid storms and blood and fear, we had found each other, and found the truth of feelings and trust no one could ever take away. The air inside the cabin tightened like a drawn wire as Daniel stepped outside, his eyes sweeping the area with slow, calculated certainty. A captured assassin sat tied to a post, his face defiant yet betraying flashes of panic as he realized how badly the situation had turned. Rachel stayed partly hidden behind a wooden beam, her heartbeat thundering, her eyes locked on Daniel as she watched him take control of the moment with a cold precision that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Daniel didn't shout or strike. He didn't need to. His presence, his eyes, and his voice were weapons sharper than any blade. "You know why you're here," he said, his voice deep and steady, each word sinking into the air like a slow-moving ripple. The assassin froze, fear flickering in his eyes beneath a mask of stubbornness. Daniel moved closer, every step measured, applying a pressure so intangible yet so powerful it forced the man to reveal more than he intended, while accidentally confirming where his unseen allies were hiding. Rachel felt every breath in her chest, terrified yet unable to look away, as Daniel manipulated the situation with chilling precision. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder, his expression almost merciful though unyielding. Every action has consequences. Be honest, and that honesty will determine your fate. The man trembled, his voice croaking. I don't know anything. Daniel leaned in slightly, his dark eyes piercing straight through lies and fear, his voice calm but heavy with authority. You are lying. I see everything, every connection, every movement. Cooperate, and I will do everything within reason to make sure you survive this. Rachel watched, breath caught in her throat, mesmerized by the calculated softness and controlled power in every gesture. She saw how Daniel used psychology rather than violence, how he bent the moment to his will, dismantling the assassin's defenses without lifting a hand. Second by second, the tied man broke, his defiance melting into raw terror beneath the crushing weight of Daniel's presence. When he finally confessed everything, Daniel gave a single nod, stepped back, and with nothing more than a quiet shake of his head, signaled his men to take the assassin away. Rachel exhaled shakily, a mix of fear and admiration washing over her, as she realized that between brutality and strategy, Daniel always chose mastery, using intelligence and psychological force to make the enemy collapse under the cold, quiet pressure of his mind, rather than his fists. The black car slid through Seattle's damp streets, the glow of streetlights reflecting against its polished windows like a veil being drawn over the meeting about to unfold. Rachel sat silently beside Daniel, her fingers gripping the edge of the seat, feeling the pressure radiating from him, how he scanned every corner, how no detail escaped him. They stepped into an old building whose quiet exterior felt almost unnatural, only to find inside a completely different world, a place where power and fear intertwined into a thick, heavy atmosphere. The meeting room was wide, lit gently, with a long, dark wooden table at the center, surrounded by men in suits whose expressions were carved from stone, each gesture deliberate, each glance sharp as they assessed Daniel and Rachel, weighing their position in this unforgiving game. A few familiar faces from other underground factions were present, each carrying their own authority and hidden ambition, none willing to show weakness, and all knowing that even the smallest mistake could cost them their lives or their dominance. Daniel strode directly to the center of the room, his gaze sweeping across everyone, the faint smile on his lips cold and intentional enough to assert his presence, but never enough to reveal his true emotions. Rachel stood beside him, her heart pounding as she realized this was not a meeting but a battlefield of strategy, where every word came with deadly consequences. Daniel's deep, steady voice cut through the silence, powerful and unmistakable. He thanked everyone for coming, reminded them that they were not there for friendship or personal gain, but because of a shared threat, an organization that had crossed the line and forced them into cooperation. Each word tightened the air, pulling every eye toward him, including those masking doubt and hidden calculations. Rachel felt every shift in the room, the tension, the power, the way Daniel steered the discussion, asking questions, laying out facts, analyzing movements, forcing others to acknowledge his authority without ever needing to raise his voice. Representatives exchanged sharp glances and subtle gestures, aware that a single misstep could cost them everything. Daniel guided the conversation with uncanny precision, and every so often he leaned slightly, letting his gaze fall on Rachel not merely to acknowledge her, but as if reminding the room that she was not an outsider, that her presence alone was a reason for them to treat his position with respect. Rachel remained still, feeling the tension crawl along her spine, witnessing each strategic move, each psychological push, each unseen pressure point Daniel deployed flawlessly. At the same time, she saw the way he protected her quietly, subtly shielding her from prying eyes or dangerous attention, embedding her presence into the flow of his authority. Every agreement, every sentence, carried two meanings, where justice and power mixed in a way she had never imagined. And she saw, with sharp clarity, that Daniel was not just a leader of the underground world, he was the one who balanced every factor to maintain power and ensure the survival of everyone at the table. He controlled every detail, from his gaze to the distance between chairs, from tone to posture, turning the room into a stage where everyone moved according to an invisible but brutal set of rules. And Rachel, though fear coursed through her, could not take her eyes off him. She recognized that in this world, intelligence and subtlety mattered more than force, and Daniel embodied both with a frightening elegance that left her breathless with admiration and fear. Rachel stood beside Daniel in the grand lobby of the Seattle hotel, her hand resting lightly on his arm, an instinctive gesture, yet one filled with meaning. She felt the weight of his authority, the presence that made people lower their eyes when he passed. She was both his companion and a symbol, now woven into the image Daniel presented to the underworld, an image that now included her. His eyes swept over the room, taking in every movement, every glance, and Rachel realized everyone was watching them, every step, every smile, every brush of a hand measured as though they were performing a play where nothing could be out of place. She forced herself to stay calm, to smile at the right moments, to nod politely when Daniel introduced her to the powerful faces gathered there, though her heart continued its rapid, unsteady rhythm. She understood that even the smallest reaction could be interpreted, misread, or used as leverage. Rachel learned to stand tall, to maintain perfect distance, her gaze steady ahead, even as her hands and body instinctively sought Daniel as a point of safety. She noticed his brief, silent glances toward her, his faintly furrowed brow reminding to her to maintain her role, while also guarding her against curious eyes and questions that should never be asked. She sensed the tension threading through the room, the way people exchanged subtle expressions or discreet signals, and she knew she was standing in the center of a power game where every movement carried weight. Daniel remained composed, his deep voice steady as he controlled every situation, how he spoke, how he moved, the way he observed. Rachel followed closely, adjusting her breath, her posture, her gestures to match the role she had been given. The proximity was at once comforting and intimidating. Every touch of Daniel's hand on her back, or every quiet question he murmured at her ear, tightening the mix of nerves and anticipation running through her. She realized she was becoming an indispensable part of this performance, not just a mask, but also a real person in a dangerous narrative. Daniel was using the role of official partner, not as a display, but as a shield, a way to ensure she existed safely within his world. Rachel learned when to smile, when to bow her head, when to stay silent, reading the cues Daniel sent her like an unwritten language, sensing the rhythm of the game. Every glance, every nod, every angle of her posture carried meaning. And when they stepped onto the balcony overlooking Seattle's nightscape, the city lights trembling across the river like shards of gold, Rachel stood close to Daniel, feeling both warmth and tremor inside her. She understood then that her position was both protection and trial, and in that quiet moment amid hidden negotiations, calculated looks, and power steering every breath, she realized she had become a vital link, not only in Daniel's world but also within her own fear, courage, and unraveling emotions. Each heartbeat, each breath mingled with the intricate, ruthless rhythm of the power surrounding them, and she accepted her role, knowing it gave her strength even as it made her vulnerable. Rachel learned to balance her true emotions with the image Daniel needed her to hold both witness and participant. And in that silent moment standing beside him, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Protector and protected, mask and truth, existing with him in a world where power, affection, and survival blended into something so complex it could not be separated. In the quiet days that followed, Daniel proved that his protection extended far beyond physical safety. He sat me down one evening and explained, with calm precision, that the nightmare at the cabin had been erased. His team had scrubbed the site clean, removing every trace of the struggle, every casing, every drop of blood. But cleaning the crime scene wasn't enough. He had to ensure the hunters would never return. Daniel's expression remained grim, but satisfied as he told me the rest. The meeting last night wasn't just for show. I used the assassin's confession to expose the internal betrayal within, their faction. The leadership has been restructured, and the rogue elements that targeted you have been neutralized. He leaned forward, his voice low and absolute. We made a trade. I keep their secrets, and in exchange, you are strictly off limits. To them, you are no longer a loose end. You are untouchable. If they look in your direction again, their entire organization burns. It never happened, he told me, his gaze leaving no room for doubt. There is no police report. No investigation. Your name is nowhere. He had buried the truth deep enough that even the law couldn't find it. Daniel paused for a moment, his gaze softening as it rested on me. "And regarding your job," he added, his voice steady and assuring, "do not worry. The hospital administration received a documented request for emergency compassionate leave the day you went missing. It was processed through the board and fully approved. To them, you were simply tending to a sudden family crisis, not running for your life. Your position is waiting for you, untouched." Rachel returned to the hospital on a misty morning in Seattle, a strange blend of unfamiliarity and aching familiarity wrapping around her as she stepped through the glass doors. The smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of machines told her she had come back to the world she once believed she had left behind. Even though her heart still carried the weight of the days she had spent with Daniel and the darkness she could not fully name. She walked through the halls, offering polite, fragile smiles to colleagues, noticing the curious glances and unspoken questions about her absence. Rachel settled into her station, touched the medical charts and the stethoscope, feeling the quiet warmth of her profession ease the lingering tension that pulsed in her chest. She remembered the long nights staying awake with patients, the exhausting shifts in Miami, but now everything felt softer, calmer, as though the rhythm of hospital life moved with gentle order, so different from the chaos she had survived on the yacht and in the forest. She tended to patients, each familiar task washing her hands, checking pulses, reviewing charts bringing a fragile sense of peace. Yet within her, she still guarded the secret of what had happened, the memory of Daniel and the world she never imagined she would be tangled in. The stormy night on the yacht hovered over her joy like a thin veil, quiet but ever-present. She tried to focus on her patients, but her gaze often drifted to the window, to the hurried people on the street, reminding her of Daniel's steady eyes, the way he shielded her, the complicated mix of fear, unease, and a subtle spark of longing that still lived inside her. Colleagues stopped by to chat and laugh. Rachel smiled back, answered their questions, but beneath her calm responses, her heart still fluttered whenever she remembered Daniel's words. His unexpected tenderness in the midst of danger. She told herself that her world was still the hospital, still the steady rhythm of caring for others, but something inside her had shifted. She had lived through moments she would never forget. Moving through the busy corridors, she found a delicate balance between two worlds living in the present, while carrying a secret that belonged entirely to her. She knew that returning to normal life didn't mean she could forget what had happened. She learned to smile again, to live with the tension inside her, with emotions that were both frightening and strangely exhilarating. And when her shift ended, Rachel stood by the window, watching the soft rain fall over Seattle, realizing that she had returned to ordinary life, but part of her remained open to the unexpected, to the difficult choices still waiting ahead. Between the routine of the hospital and the memories that refused to fade, Rachel walked forward carrying the strength, sensitivity, and courage she had learned still a nurse, yet also a woman who had survived storms both outside and within her. Rachel had just set her keys on the table, preparing to put her things away after a long day at the hospital, when she heard a soft knock at the door. Her heartbeat quickened. She walked toward it, her body tense with instinctive caution, and when she opened it, she froze. Daniel stood there, his coat damp from the rain, his eyes calm yet holding something deep and familiar. Rachel stopped short, words trapped on her tongue. Daniel offered a faint half-smile, his voice low and warm. "Are you all right?" A wave of comfort and unease washed over her at once. She didn't know whether to be relieved or wary. Daniel stepped into the apartment, carrying a folded umbrella, the window light catching the damp strands of his hair, making him appear both close and impossibly far. Rachel closed the door, reminding herself that his unexpected presence made her heart tremble, but also reminded her of dangers she had hoped not to face again. Daniel walked around the room, his eyes scanning everything carefully, as if checking for threats, before turning back to her, his voice deep and steady. "I know you're trying to go back to normal, but I need to be sure you're safe." Warmth and fear mingled inside her. She looked at him and saw both the man she had met on the stormy yacht and the part of his world she had never expected to enter. The distance between them seemed to vanish under the weight of unspoken meaning. Rachel stepped closer, a dozen questions rising in her mind but none making it past her lips. Daniel furrowed his brow gently, his voice softening. "You don't have to say anything. You just need to know I'm here." The reassurance loosened something tight inside her. She wanted to lean into him, yet feared the peace he brought might only be temporary. Daniel moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers, as if he could see every thought and fear she carried. His presence filled the small apartment with an odd sense of safety, a place where protection and an uncontrollable stir of emotion mixed in equal measure. Rachel felt her heartbeat fall into rhythm with his, each second between them stretching into something intimate and fragile. They stood there, quiet but full of words. Neither of them spoke. Daniel slowly took a seat and gestured for Rachel to sit across from him, and with only a shared look, they both understood that the world outside could still be chaos. Yet in this moment, they were safe together. His unexpected arrival made one thing clear. Daniel was the only person who could make her feel both at peace and on edge in the same breath. Dinner was prepared in Rachel's small but warmly lit kitchen, the candlelight flickering across the table, casting long, delicate shadows on the walls. Daniel sat across from her, quietly watching as she poured red wine into their glasses, the silence between them carrying a rare moment of calm amid the chaos of the past days. Rachel broke the silence first, her voice low but steady as she asked, "Have you ever imagined yourself living a normal life, Daniel?" He took a slow sip of wine, his gaze settling on the candle flame as though searching for an answer in that wavering light, and replied gently, "A normal life? I don't think it's something I ever let myself consider, but sometimes I wish I could leave everything behind and live like everyone else. My world doesn't allow that." Rachel drew in a long breath, her fingers trembling slightly around the stem of her glass. "I've always wondered," she whispered, "when you love someone like you, does it mean loving the darkness you're hiding? Or only the part you let me see?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes deep but soft. "Love means accepting all of someone, Rachel, light and shadow both. You know the danger and the secrets that surround me, and yet you're here. That means more to me than you know." Warmth washed over her for a moment, followed by the fear of what the future might bring. She asked softly, "If one day I had to choose between safety and love, what do you think I would do?" He leaned forward, placing his hand gently over hers, his touch warm and steady. "I can't choose for you," he admitted, "but I know I would do everything in my power to protect you, so you never have to face that kind of pain." Rachel closed her eyes for a heartbeat, letting the swirl of emotions settle before she opened them again with a sad smile. "You make me want to trust you, and fear you at the same time." Daniel's smile was quiet. He turned his hand palm up to interlace his fingers with mine, a gesture both tender and resolute. "And that is why we have to walk this path together, to face the darkness, to find our own choices along the way." They fell silent again, the only sounds the soft crackle of the candle flame and the ticking of the clock. Rachel set her glass down, reaching gently for his hand. "You know," she said softly, "you're the only person who makes me feel safe in the middle of danger, and the only one who makes my heart lose its rhythm." He tightened his hold on her fingers, his voice low and sincere. "And you are the one who makes me want to live for something beyond the darkness, Rachel. Only you." They ate slowly, speaking in hushed tones, each word wrapped around the depths of their shared burdens, stories of the past, of pain, of hope, and of the difficult choices waiting ahead. The candles reflected in their eyes, highlighting both love and caution. They understood that this dinner was more than a meal. It was a moment of connection, a place where each confronted their own shadows, while offering the other a fragile but sincere trust. Their eyes met across the table, saying everything words could not fear: longing, tenderness, and a hope they did not dare name. The meal ended with a small smile, but inside each of them, their hearts raced with the weight of choices still waiting to be made, the reality of a love born in darkness. They knew the road ahead would be full of trials, but tonight, in this fragile pause, they had each other. At dawn, a soft wash of sunlight slipped through the window, touching their faces gently. The lines of exhaustion still lingered, but their eyes held a quiet spark of faith and hope. Outside, Seattle awakened with its usual rhythm, the sound of cars, the chirping of birds weaving into the morning air. Yet inside the apartment, everything was still enough that they could hear each other's breath. Rachel looked out at the small boats gliding across the Elliott Bay, feeling both relief and a stirring ache. Just then, her phone buzzed softly on the wooden table. A single message appeared from an unknown number. "Safe. Far away. Don't worry. A." Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a final weight lifting from her shoulders. Ashley was safe. She knew darkness and danger would always encircle them, but love and courage helped people find light in the deepest trials. Daniel stood behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders, their silence becoming a moment of profound connection without a single word spoken. The image etched itself into Rachel's memory, a reminder that sometimes one must embrace danger in order to truly live and love. Their story was not only about love, but about resilience, trust, and the ability to forgive, reminding all of us to cherish the ones we love and to face hardship rather than run from it. My dear friends, if this story touched your heart, please remember to subscribe to our channel, click like, and share so you won't miss any of our daily videos. We would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your comparisons to real-life experiences, and the emotions this story awakened in you. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching this good health, joyful days, and peace in every moment. Goodbye, and see you again soon.